Coming up on Good Journeys with Ben Veal.
I think when it comes to being a sort of normal person at work, then it's okay to talk about bringing your authentic self. But when you're in a position of power, there is a need to consider that responsibility. And when you're in a leadership position, you can't truly bring your authentic self to work for everyone to follow you. And there are certain politicians and high profile, very wealthy leaders out there who you could argue are very authentic, but I'm not sure that they are people that we want to follow.
Welcome to Good Journeys with Ben Veal, the show that explores the trails traveled and lessons learned from some truly incredible people.
Hello and welcome to another purposeful conversation here on Good Journeys with Ben Veal. Joining me for this episode is a fantastic guest who has just published the wonderful new book, Nobody Believes You, Become a Leader People Will Follow. Jenni Field is an international speaker, podcaster, business communication strategist and author who set up Redefining Communications in 2017. A former president of the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, Jenni is hugely passionate about giving back and sharing her expertise. I just know that Jenni is going to bring tons of optimism and great energy to today's show. This will be a very, very good one indeed. Jenni, welcome to Good Journeys. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So nice to see you. And thank you so much for having me on the show.
Just saying off air, you have a beautiful studio. I'm particularly appreciating your colour coding of books, which is you're a lady after my own heart.
Thank you. It makes no sense, as my husband says, now that they're colour coded, but it looks more aesthetically pleasing. So that's the main
Absolutely.
thing.
And that's a big part of books. And speaking of aesthetically pleasing, so you've just published this beautiful brand new book, Nobody Believes You. I mean, I love the cover, but much more importantly is what's within most pages. This book centres all around becoming the kind of leader that others will want to follow. So I guess the big question first, why is credibility so important to leadership?
So the reason credibility is so important is because it's the right thing to focus on if you're in a leadership position, unlike the word authentic or the trait authentic that people often talk about. So when it was about 2019, I started to think about and question whether or not authentic was the right thing for leadership. And that led me into a lot more reading and my own research eventually into it. But I was exploring what it was that we really want leaders to be. I think when it comes to being a sort of normal person at work, then it's okay to talk about bringing your authentic self. But when you're in a position of power, there is a need to consider that responsibility. And when you're in a leadership position, you can't truly bring your authentic self to work for everyone to follow you. And there are certain politicians and high profile, very wealthy leaders out there who you could argue are very authentic, but I'm not sure that they are people that we want to follow. And therefore, they aren't particularly credible in that position in leadership. And that is where the challenge comes in. So that's why I talk about credibility more than authenticity, because it's a lot more depth to it. And it encapsulates everything that we're asking leaders to be and been bombarding them to be really since the pandemic.
So you dedicate this book to the leaders in your life and career that have taught you so much. Who are some of those leaders and what did you learn from them?
It's a good dedication, isn't it? It's deliberately.
It's a lovely dedication.
So some of the leaders that I wanted to dedicate it to include my dad. So my dad was a big part of the creation of this book because he challenged some of my thinking around credibility and the different practices that exist around it. And others would be that there have been one or two leaders in my career who have helped me understand what it takes to be a leader that really trusts their people. And there are others that have just taught me a phenomenal amount about leadership in a very male-dominated world and also the impact you can have on others. And I think when you surround yourself with lots of different leaders, it's really important to sort of absorb that and grow from that, whether it's I don't want to do that or I definitely want to do that. It's just absorbing all of that and taking it on board and recognizing the kind of leader you want to be, really.
Yeah, and I mean, you've kind of mentioned, kind of empathy earlier on. Like you talk in a book about vulnerability in leadership, and obviously, you're talking about research you did kind of pre-pandemic, and then how leadership changed during those very strange times. Um, how should a leader show vulnerability, but also remain strong for those that they lead? Because that feels to me like a very tricky balance to get right.
Yeah, vulnerability is one of the practices that I think a lot of people struggle with. And it's the one that was talked about so much in the pandemic, be more vulnerable, be more vulnerable. But nobody really explained what that meant. So people were just left going, do I cry in front of people? I don't know what this means. Whereas when I talk about vulnerability, I talk about the need to build connection. So that's the outcome you're looking for. And a lot of the practices that I talk about in the book are linked to an outcome. So something will happen if you don't have that practice. And that's what you're trying to build in some cases. So for vulnerability, what we want to build is connection. But we have to get that balance between being intimate and personal. They're kind of two different things. So you want to be personal, but you don't want to be intimate. And it's finding that balance, really. So it's not about just sharing everything, because that doesn't necessarily help you establish a connection. If the outcome you want is to connect with people, you have to share things that will enable that connection. If you just start talking about, your hobbies or things like that don't resonate with people, it will have the opposite effect. And actually, I was at an event once where somebody was talking about how they were learning to fly a plane. And I tell you, the majority of the audience just totally switched off because nobody could relate to that being your hobby. I thought he meant on like Microsoft pilot or whatever the pilot game thing is, the simulation. But no, he meant a real plane. And that's where it doesn't work, because you haven't sort of understood your audience, and it doesn't build connection. So you have to be careful with it, but it's a hugely powerful tool to really help bring that human side forward, really.
Yeah, and I guess linked to that is likability. So you say in the book that a credible leader has to be likable. What should that look like ideally within the world of business? Can you be an effective leader without being likable?
So when we define likability, it's important to make a distinction between being liked and being likable, because they're two different things. So we have this need as human beings to sort of want to be liked. And when you're in a leadership position, that's just impossible. Okay, you're going to make decisions that are going to be tough. There's going to be people that aren't going to like you, and that's okay. We don't all go to work to make friends, but some of us do, and therefore being liked is very important. But in a leadership role, it's about being likable, and that's about having charisma. It's about being agreeable, so nice to be around, and it's around being a bit lighthearted, so you're sort of lifting that mood at the same time. All of those things mean that you're pleasant to be around. I'm happy to be in your company. I don't have to like you enough to go on holiday or go out for dinner, but I need to be okay being in your, and that's what we're looking for. So it's pulling apart that distinction. And there are some people that will find likability more important than others. So in the 8 practices, there will be some cultures and some people that will see some of those as much higher up or much more important than others. There will be some differences in gender in terms of that importance as well. And that's what you have to sort of be mindful of. So it's not about wanting everyone to like you, but just be nice to be around, which I don't think is difficult to ask.
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? You're obviously managing it, but it depends.
We live in hope.
It depends what mood you catch me in, to be honest. Some days you ask my wife, and I'm not sure the likability factor is always high, but sometimes. You've got this kind of credibility wheel in the book, which I found absolutely fascinating. How have you settled upon those kind of the 8 essential elements of strong leadership?
So, as I sort of alluded to at the start of the conversation, 2019 was when I started to question everything about sort of credibility and authenticity. We had the pandemic in 2020 and leaders were bombarded with more questions. And then in around 2022, I think it was, I started to gather all of the different, as I called them at the time, sort of different traits and behaviours that would make somebody credible. So what is it that we are looking at? And I came up with 9 different things. And I tested that using a survey. So I did a survey with leaders online and I did a survey with followers online, not necessarily matched, to find out how they felt felt about those. So I asked people to cover off all of the different demographics, so I could cover where they were from, their gender, their age, so I could see if there was any differences there. And I asked followers why they followed some people and not others. So it gave me a free text questionnaire with lots of different language, which was helpful. And that's where the original 9 turned into the 8 that we have today. And so the wheel shows you each of the 8 practices. And then within that, there's sort of 3 words that sit within them that just help bring them to life. So where I talked about likability just now, the 3 words underneath that are agreeable, charisma, and lighthearted. And in the book, I tell sort of stories and, as you know, sort of talk about what that means. So that's how the 8 sort of came to be, because you don't necessarily need some of those subset words as sort of core words, but some of the 8 things like integrity and trustworthy are sort of foundational to that credibility piece.
And you mentioned, obviously, we touched on it a few times, the pandemic. Now, like you were as I said at the start, you were the CIPR's president in 2020, and you played a really big leadership role in kind of leading the institute and all of us as communicators during some really tough and surreal times. I'm not going to say unprecedented. I said it, but I'm not saying it. Like how was that for you, Jenni, that whole period, and what did you learn about yourself and your leadership style during that bizarre period that we all lived through?
It was bizarre, and it was an incredibly challenging time. And as the president, I was doing monthly video updates for members, and you can sort of track the emotion of the world. It's really in a way where some of them I'm sort of really upbeat and positive, and I'm probably less so. I think the thing I learned the most in that time for me in terms of my leadership style was my ability to trust in the skills and abilities of those around me. So I definitely learned that I step back and step into a role that is the most valuable role during that time, rather than trying to get involved in lots of detail and I think you go one of 2 ways as a leader. I think you sometimes go in and want to really micromanage and be part of it, or you step back and say, do you know what, I trust that you all know what you're doing. I'm going to step over here and we'll come back and you'd let me know when you need me. And that was probably the biggest thing I learned, was my ability to have that balance with the team.
Yeah, I mean, for me, 2020, that was the year that kind of this, for me, Second Mountain was born, because I was working agency side, COVID hits, and bang goes my senior PR job. And then I decided to, go solo like so many of us and take a gamble on myself. I'm so glad I did, because it changed my life in many ways. But I think for us as communicators, it changed so much about the way that we work. And I know that you were doing some research kind of before the pandemic about deskless workers and kind of maintaining good communication with them. And then that's something you've continued to explore as some kind of semblance of normality has returned to the workplace. I guess talk me through that work. What interests you about the idea of communicating with deskless workers and where we are now? Because for me, I work in a very hybrid environment. I'm never the same place for 2 days. Very different to when I was working a 9 to 5 before. So how's that changed for people within organizations as well?
So interesting, because a lot of what we found when we did the research into deskless workers definitely applies across to other workers as well. The research we did with deskless workers was in 2019 and 2023. So it tracks either side of the pandemic. And my reason for being interested in that is that I spent, how many years? 6, 7 years working for a company where we were involved in the catering in travel locations around the world. So I was head of internal communications for the UK part of that business for a few years. And I had 8,000 people who were serving coffee and baguettes in train stations and airports across the UK. 2,000 people in a sort of support function environment, or not so much deskless. And it was hard. And so, and I always found at conferences that all of the case studies were people talking about their amazing communication work, but it was to everyone that sat at a desk. And I was like, yes, that would be lovely. So that's what I think triggered the research and the need to look at that. And what that research really tells us is there's some very specifics about deskless workers, but it talks a lot about the importance of managers, and it talks a lot about the importance of the relevance of communication. And I think that tracks across hybrid, in-office and deskless workers. And the thing I think that's changed so much with the pandemic is there needs to be so much intention behind how we communicate. we did a sort of lift and shift in a crisis, and that's fine. But what works in a crisis doesn't usually work day to day because it's a crisis. So we haven't yet figured out what work needs to look and feel like in that sort of post-pandemic world, and therefore what the communication infrastructure needs to look like, and that sort of day-to-day work with our teams and things like that. So there's still a lot to figure out, but I think if you're making time and space for each other and having video calls and face-to-face where you can, then it will start to just pay off hugely, because it's about helping people feel connected.
Yeah, and I guess also, I mean, there was a big part in that pandemic around kind of, I guess, for lack of a better term, pastoral support. So kind of being there for people, checking in on their emotions as well as their workload, certainly in that early going. And I don't know, in your experience, like from a leadership perspective, whether you're seeing that as a trend that's continued, or whether obviously we've come back to a market that, you know, the economy is in not in a great way, and no one's quite figured out what post-pandemic life looks like fully. And I wonder whether, in your experience, you're seeing leaders kind of having that real empathy for staff, or whether there is more a sense of back to normal now.
I think it's on a journey. So I think we had this, like you said, this huge spike in this need for it in the pandemic. And then I think everyone sort of started to come back a bit to normal. The trends we're seeing in 2025, especially around leadership and workplace, involve things like well-being and burnout, and making sure that we're addressing that in the workplace. That did disappear, I think, in sort of 2023, 2024. People were so focused on innovation, growth. What can we do? Let's keep going. Let's get going. That we sort of lost a lot of that. And that's created quite a lot of chaos in organizations. So I think that this year, certainly in the analysis I've done of the trends, it's definitely coming in more in terms of that well-being, burnout, and not so much engagement, but definitely looking at how the experience of work is impacting people as human beings. And that's ultimately what I think we'll start paying a bit more attention to now.
So I'm always really, really fascinated by authors and author journeys, because having just finished work on my first book and looking towards my second, I know how much time goes into writing a book, and so I've so much more appreciation for it now. I know obviously nobody believes you isn't your first book. Talk me through your journey as an author, and also what it's been like to bring this lovely book to market.
So this one was very, very different to my first one, because of the way I published it was different. So I think if you work with like traditional publishers, it's just quite a different process, whereas this one was a bit of a hybrid publishing opportunity for me. So I worked with an editor in the US quite early on, because I had these ideas, but I didn't really know what they were. I had a lot of thoughts, but I couldn't pull them together. So I worked with a fabulous guy called Jeff Goins over in the US, who really helped me just through coaching unpick that thinking and sort of make it make sense. And it was through working with him. And I say he's an editor, but it was more than that. It was helping sort of really shape that thinking into something that would be a book. So we worked together on that. And then he stayed with me while I was writing, and his team helped support sort of the editing process. But this book I wrote sort of all in one go, whereas if you go down a traditional publisher, you sort of write it chapter by chapter. But this was really nice because I was sort of dipping in and out of different chapters and moving stories into different places that would bring the different practices to life. And there was the highlight for me, I think, in the journey for this one was my first draft, having a call with Jeff, looking at the first draft. And he'd put loads of comments on it, just going, "No, please stop doing this." And it was where I was a bit conditioned to sort of either reference other people's work to bring that into mine. And he was very clear that, this is your book. These are your ideas. These are your thoughts. You don't need to bring in other people's to kind of support that. Just share yours. And sometimes you need someone to say, like, let your voice come forward. And I just I can look on it and laugh now, and I did sort of chuckle at the time, but there was lots of chunks that then sort of had to come out. So it was a journey for sure.
Well, there's transition, because I found this from working in PR for so long, where obviously your job is to champion other people, and other people are the expert spokespeople. And then there comes this moment when you're like, oh wow, I'm actually the person with a voice. It's quite a strange jump to do that.
Yeah, you've got to be comfortable with people having an opinion about your opinion. So I think especially writing a book, I said this about the first one. The first book is sort of my brain in a book about communication. And it is, for me, one of the most vulnerable things you can do, because there will be people that will disagree, they'll have other views, and that's fine. But you have to be okay with that. You have to be okay with the fact that people aren't going to agree with that and have different opinions. And that takes quite a lot of strength when you're sort of pouring your soul into these pages. And then someone goes, no, this isn't for me. And you have to just let them be like, it's fine. It's not for everybody.
No, and another thing, I think that, obviously you've built up a real profile as well through podcasting. We were talking about that off air. Like you are a prolific podcaster, many more episodes under your belt than I have. And I'd be really fascinated to know your journey there. I mean, what has podcasting done to help you to grow both kind of personally and professionally, Jenni?
So I've really enjoyed my podcasting journey. I used to have one with some friends, Advita Patel and Trudy Lewis. It was called the Calm-Edged Rebels, and we would just chat about different topics. And I loved that because we're three women from different backgrounds, and we would just talk about everything. And I really enjoyed that because it gave me the ability to explore so many themes. My own podcast, Redefining Communications with Jenni Field, is just me talking, and they're only 15 minutes, which is intentional. I wanted them to be quite short, but the reason I started them, to be honest, was because I needed a way for people to hear me rather than just read the stuff I was saying, because I've had feedback that I can sound a bit like telling people off when I write stuff down, and I was like, I'm not, like, if you can hear me, you know that I'm not telling you off. So that was part of the reason for doing it, was because I thought if people can hear me, then they'll know that I'm not having a go at them.
Well, that's wonderful. I love that. And how many seasons are you in now with your podcast?
So I think it's seasons. I think we've just done season 6, which is linked to the book, and then I'm not sure if there's going to be a season 7. I'm sort of playing around with it. I've got some other opportunities around that are potential podcasting projects with some other people, so I'm exploring those, but I think it's a great tool for conversation and discussion. And I think that's what I like about it, is it encourages people to have different thinking and question stuff and learn, and that's where I think it's really powerful. So never say never to new seasons, but I always think if you're struggling to find the content, it's probably time to have a rest.
Yeah, I think what's wonderful about podcasts is there's a seasonality to them. There's also a fluidity to them. So you see a lot of podcasters who will do a show for a certain period of time and then they'll evolve to something else. The show name may change. They may completely change it and move into a different niche, because through podcasting, I think you as the podcaster learn a lot about yourself as well as your guests or whatever your format may be. I'm a very different person to the person that started doing this. And a large part of that is because I've been very blessed to speak with so many hugely fascinating people like yourself, who I wouldn't probably have a chance to speak with were it not for the podcast. So it's a fascinating, as a communicator, it's a fascinating route in, but as a person, it's just, I've been on my own good journey through doing good journeys, and I feel very blessed by that. But also there's something about podcasting which is just so, it's so more personal and it's far more raw and it's more rugged. And in a world that we're used to, where every word is checked carefully and every bit of communication is kind of thought through so much, I really like the natural flow of a podcast and the fact that you just get people being their own authentic selves, but give the bad and the ugly. And that's what I think is quite magical about podcasts. And then how people consume them as well. Like some of my best moments during 2020's turbulence were going out on really, really muddy walks, getting away from it all and listening to someone talk. And I think they're such a personal thing, a podcast. So, I mean, whatever it looks like next, I'm sure whatever you do is going to be really, really interesting, whatever it's called.
Yeah, whatever we do, wherever we go. Yeah. I always think there's the adventure to be had in just trying different stuff. And you've got to try things, if they work, and if they don't, so be it. But I think when you're running a business and you're trying to change stuff about the world of work, which I feel so strongly about in terms of this leadership piece, then you kind of have to just give it a go and hope for the best.
So how did you settle on, going back to your book, how did you settle on Nobody Believes You? Because that is a fantastic title, really powerful cover. Quite a provocative thing to say, though. Nobody believes you to a leader. So how did you settle on that as a name?
was one of my sessions with Jeff where we were talking about what the title was going to be. And I think as we were having conversations about why credibility was important, and he was just sort of questioning, and as all good coaches do, but why? And it sort of comes out in terms of, if you're not credible, you are not believable, and therefore people won't follow you. So it sort of naturally tracks in terms of that conversation. And then he came up with the nobody believes you, and I think I immediately winced and was like, oh God, that's I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable. And so then we added sort of, become a leader people will follow. And over time, I've got more comfortable with it. And I tested it a little bit. I shared it with a few people, and nearly everybody has the reaction you had, which is, I love the title. It's deliberately, provocative. As a consultant, I have a lot of the values around being bold and quite challenging, but quite fun. And it feels like it really fits with that. It's not accusatory, but it's quite factual, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it is. I mean, it's playful, but also thought-provoking at the same time, which is why it immediately jumped out at me. I remember the first time you announced it, I was like, that's a fantastic concept and name for a book. And in such a crowded kind of literary market space, you have to do that, don't you? You have to grab attention immediately. Mean, there's so many leadership books out there. Why did you feel that you were the person to write this book, and why did you feel this book needed to exist in the world?
So I've read a lot of leadership books. I read a lot, as background reading for this book, and none of them are written, as far as I'm aware, by someone that is an expert in communication. And I think that expertise, especially around internal communication and employee experience, means that I'm looking at leadership from a very specific perspective. And I think that's often missing. It's the outcome that's missing from the leadership books. So many of them talk about sort of generic leadership principles, but they don't really focus on the impact of other people as a result of somebody else's words and behaviours. And that's what I felt was missing, is that it didn't have, the other books out there didn't have stuff you could actually do, whereas each of the chapters in the book give you the skills and strategies to actually do something, to go, oh, okay, if I need to, listen actively, and then Jenni's given me some pointers about how I can demonstrate that. That's practical. I can do that tomorrow. And that's why I wanted to do it as well. And I wanted it to be short, which is intentional. So the book is only, I think it's 110 pages. People are reading it in sort of 3 hours. And that was the point, because most leaders don't have time. That came up in the research, that time was the biggest thing that was stopping them from building their credibility. Well, 3 hours is not that much time when you consider it against most of the other books on the market, which are at least double that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it would be remiss as well of me not to kind of mention today, as we're talking about leadership, obviously, like, we haven't had the world's best leaders modelled to us over the last few years, and that doesn't really seem to be changing. I mean, only this week at time of recording, I've finally taken the plunge and left X, because I can't be on there anymore, which actually makes me very sad, because I adored Twitter for so long, and it was such a fantastic, nurturing, beautiful space. But from a leadership perspective, I can't be there anymore. It's hard, isn't it, the world we're in right now, because it makes you realize that with the wrong kind of leaders in place, you can really massively impact and hurt people. But I guess it just underscores the importance of books like this and work like you're doing to really demonstrate actually the importance of leadership and why to get it right.
Yeah, it's really hard, isn't it? I was speaking at an event earlier on last year about the book on the same day that the new president of the US was announced. And I thought, people are going to ask me some questions about this. So I spent a bit of time having a look at why people follow some leaders when other people are baffled as to why they would follow them. Because and that comes down to a lot of things around culture. It comes down to the skills of leaders, and it comes down to so many different factors. And I try to stay away from, this is a good leader, this is a bad leader, because I've worked in organisations where I have thrived and other people have said it was a very toxic culture. And I think our own values, experiences, what we need really, really contributes to some of those things. I think what's fundamental to me is that the 8 practices of credibility need to all be in there for you to be a leader that people will follow, good or bad, depending on how you might view that. But you need to have all of those 8. If you don't have them, if you're very strong on one of them, and one of the practices is being a visionary, but that means about having a vision, and that's being quite inspiring, quite passionate. You've got good communication skills. If you don't have that, you will have apathy in your team. So if you're very good as a leader at communicating, you're very good at showing your passion, you're quite good at inspiring people, you will get huge movement, which is obviously the opposite of apathy. So if you've got that, you'll get a reaction and you'll get an outcome. But if you don't have some of the other things, if you're not trustworthy, or you don't have integrity, or you lack empathy, gradually those people will stop following you. It will take time, but there would be a shift. And I think that's important to think about as well, is that you might see people follow someone for a while, and then gradually we might start to go, oh, actually, I'm not quite sure, because this has happened and that's happened. And I think we do that in life, in friendships and different things, where you meet people and think this person's amazing. And then, 3 weeks later, you're going, oh, actually, they've done this and I'm not sure. Like, it all unravels quite quickly if all of those things aren't in place.
Well, I think what was quite interesting, just very quickly circling back to the pandemic, was those first pivotal few weeks in March 2020, I think, was when you really genuinely saw strong leadership or not, where you really saw the genuine personality between what they've projected. I'm just talking politically, but I'm talking my own experience in the workplace and many others I spoke with, because you saw how people respond in a human crisis and what they actually genuinely valued in life. And I thought that period of time was fascinating to observe. Absolutely fascinating, seeing how brands communicated, how individuals communicated, how business leaders acted during that time was such a rare kind of glimpse behind the curtain into like the real people beyond what they project.
Yeah, and I think, and this is where it's important to not focus on being necessarily authentic, but being genuine and credible and having integrity and all of those things, because then when a crisis does happen, all of those things stay true. You just maybe shift them and do things a bit differently. But you're right, a crisis will always show up, people's sort of true nature in some of those spaces. And it was a really tough time. Like, we talked about the fact I was leading the Chartered Institute of PR at that time, and it was hard. Like, even I remember being bombarded, by certain people about this, lack of transparency, and you felt like you were being attacked all the time, no matter what you were doing. And even though we were being transparent and doing this, people suddenly felt they had permission to kind of attack you as a leader. And that was a shame, because I think we saw a lot of that in the media as well play out, where people were being sort of told off for not showing up in the best way. But it will be a time in our history that I think will be forever analysed for so many different reasons, in terms of the politics, the communication, all of it. I think will be a continued piece for discussion.
And not least by those of us who are adults traversing the workplace, but by our children who saw not always the best side of us during that time, but whose entire lives in many parts have been shaped by that. It's going to be, it will be like that kind of cultural phenomenon thing that we just have to keep looking back on, because it's fascinating. But look, my kind of last question is a big one, really. It kind of links back to what you were saying about the US election. I mean, I don't know if you've dropped a copy of that in the mail to the White House yet, but maybe you should. But my big question is, can you learn to become a leader that people will follow? Or is true leadership a skill that you kind of either have or you don't possess?
So I always say to everybody, everything in the book is something that you can build. Like, empathy is, you can build that. You can build your integrity. You can build your trustworthiness. At the start of the book, I ask a few specific questions about whether or not leadership is for you. And I first came across that approach in the book Unleashed, which is by Anne Morris and Francis Fray. And it's an excellent book on leadership. And it starts to ask some of those questions, and that's why I wanted to include just a pause to say, if you answer these questions and you're sort of saying no to all of them or yes to all of them, whichever way around it is, then put the book back down. And that's okay, because the thing for me is that leadership is a responsibility. You are leading other people to an outcome. There is a shared objective that needs to happen as a result of your leadership. we just tend to sort of promote people into leadership positions without that consideration. And I don't think we ask that question enough. I know so many people that say to me, I don't want to be in a leadership role. I like what I'm doing. I'm really happy here. I don't want to go up there. And I think that's brilliant because people are aware enough of what they want to do. So I think all of the 8 practices, everybody can build if you want to, and if you believe that you are comfortable taking on that responsibility of leadership.
Yeah.
So don't do it lightly is probably what I would say.
I think that's great advice. And I love the book. I've scribbled all over my copy. I know it's going to be the kind of book that I keep kind of come back to again and again and again. And I'd really encourage anyone with an interest in leadership or self-development to check it out and ask themselves those questions, because these are important questions, not just for workplace, but in life, actually, in terms of understanding yourself a bit better, what your motivations are and where you want to go. Where is the book available from, Jenni? How can my audience connect with you on social media? All the good stuff. Plug away.
All the good stuff. So the book is available pretty much wherever you get your book. You can get a paperback copy from Amazon, Waterstones, anywhere you like. If you want a special signed hardback version, you have to get that direct from me. So we'll pop a link in the show notes for people to grab that. And we can ship that anywhere, which is absolutely fine. I am going to be doing an audio version, but not until probably the last quarter of 2025. Just because I want to give people a bit of time to read it, and also just my calendar and getting in a studio is a bit tricky, but I do plan to do one. I did one for the first one, and I think it's important that it's accessible. In terms of social media, I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram. I am still on X, but I don't say anything because I can't quite leave, and I feel the sadness that you feel about that. But yeah, Instagram and LinkedIn, and again we can pop some links in the show notes for those as well.
Absolutely, we can. Well, look, before I wrap up, I always have a couple of thanks, Jenni. So firstly is my producer, Jeff Easton from Tall Oak Productions. We've had a couple of tech issues with this one, so Jeff's got his work cut out. But by no doubt, by the time everyone watches or listens to this, it'll be beautiful, because Jeff always brings these Good Journeys conversations to life marvellously. Thank you to my wonderful audience for joining me for these purposeful chats. But most of all, thank you to you, Jenni Field, for a wonderful, purposeful conversation today and for your great book.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. And I am sorry about the technical glitches, but it's been a delightful chat, and I'm glad we got there in the end.
It's all good. Well, this is the joy of podcasting that people don't see sometimes. But that's it for another purposeful conversation. This has been Good Journeys. I've been Ben Veal. Keep on climbing. Be good to each other. I'll see you all again very, very soon. Bye.